The Second Chechen War was the first big test of then largely unknown Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. Following an embarrassing defeat in the First Chechen War, the Russian leadership sought to restore control over Chechnya. Suspicious explosions in Russia, instability in Chechnya, and fragmentation of the Chechen leadership created a perfect ground for the Russian army to restart the war in the North Caucasus. This was going to be Putin's first war, the war that changed post-Soviet Russia and gave us a glimpse of things to come. In this video, we will be talking about the Second Chechen War. We'll give you the best overview of these events, but of course there's a rabbit hole of detail to fall into. You've probably had the experience of spending 10 minutes researching something only to find out you've got a million different leads to follow and likewise a million tabs open in your browser. Here's a recommendation to get this organized. Use our sponsor, Opera. Opera is a browser dripping with useful features. Up front, it's got a built-in AI, Aria, that you can get to look things up for you on the fly or write stuff for you in all kinds of styles. There's limitless potential right there, but it's only the start. Opera includes a free VPN service letting you up your security and change your IP address in an instant. It's got integrated social media and music apps in the sidebar to keep everything ready to use while you browse. Kings and Generals too blurry for you? Use Lucid Mode to sharpen any online video instantly. And of course, Opera gets you organized with tab islands. Related tabs are grouped together into collapsible and customizable islands, which makes multitasking much easier. You can even change your workspace to completely separate tab lineups and switch between them instantly. Great for taking your browsing someplace completely different without losing your old session. There's all kinds of other neat stuff included for free in Opera, and really you need to try it for yourself. Go to opera.com to download Opera today. If you haven't tried Opera, get it via our link in the description or the pinned comment. The First Chechen War ended in a remarkable but costly victory for pro-independence Chechens. The 1996 Kasavyrk Accords led to the withdrawal of Russian troops from Chechnya and the breakaway region's de facto independence. But Chechnya was utterly devastated after the war. The infrastructure was largely destroyed, the economy was in shambles, and poverty was widespread. The male population of Chechnya was armed after the First War and had no intention of giving up their weapons to the authorities. Chechen field commanders were largely uncontrolled by the Chechen government. Extortion, kidnapping, and illegal profiteering from oil became common. Attempts to restore order by the secular leaders of Chechnya, Aslan Maskhadov, elected president in 1997, were in vain. Many field commanders, including Salman Radiev, Arbi Bariev, a Saudi national Ibn al-Khattab, and later Shamil Basayev, called for the creation of an Islamic state in the North Caucasus and rejected the secular policies of Maskhadov. He was accused of helping the Kremlin. Several skirmishes between the government forces and the fundamentalists took place in 1998. To solve the crisis, Maskhadov banned all militia groups, but this did not change much. In 1999, attempting to reconcile with the radical groups, Chechnya adopted Sharia law. Around the same time, the envoy of the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, Gennady Shpygin, was kidnapped at Grozny airport, indicating that things were spiraling out of control. The Russian government imposed an economic blockade on Chechnya and started to bring its military assets closer to the border with the breakaway province. Fundamentalists regularly attacked the Russian troops and policemen along the border with Dagestan, raising further tension. Arguably, their worst mistake was the incursion into Dagestan in August 1999. A group of some 2,000 men, primarily foreign Islamist fighters led by Shamil Basayev and Ibn al-Khattab, invaded Dagestan, occupied several villages on the border, and proclaimed a Sharia-ruled state. Aslan Maskhadov condemned the incursion, but it was too late. The local population mobilized, and together with the Russian forces, defeated the fundamentalists, who retreated back to the mountains of Chechnya. While the fighting was still going on, a series of events shook Russia to its foundations. In the space of 16 days, 5 bomb explosions, including 3 explosions in Moscow, killed over 300 people. Russians felt angry and unprotected. Many later likened the impact of these explosions on Russians to the impact of 9/11 on Americans. Then along came a man who gave everyone an easy answer. The chief of the FSB, a successor organization of the KGB, Vladimir Putin, largely unknown to the Russian public, who became prime minister 4 days after the Chechen incursion into Dagestan, blamed these explosions on Chechen terrorism. Since some Chechen field commanders and foreigners fighting in Chechnya had already used terrorism as a tool, it was a convenient explanation for many. Some, later assassinated Russian journalists, conducted their own investigations to refute these accusations. But the most glaring blind spot in Putin's story about Chechen terrorists blowing up Russian apartment buildings was the Ryazan incident. On September 23, 1999, residents of an apartment building in the city of Ryazan reported suspicious activity in their basement, as 3 unknown men were carrying sacks to this basement from their cars, which had partially concealed license plates. The police came and arrested these people, whose car's license plate were traced to the FSB, and reported that these sacks contained explosives. Putin praised the citizens for their vigilance and the police for their professionalism, but very shortly the new director of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, who has been going strong ever since, becoming arguably the most hawkish figure in the Kremlin elite, stated that this was a training exercise and the sacks contained only sugar. Later, the historian Yuri Felstinsky and a former FSB operative who defected to Britain, Alexander Litvinenko, authored the book Blowing Up Russia, where they accused the FSB of carrying out the explosions in Russia to create a pretext to invade Chechnya. Litvinenko was later poisoned with polonium for this, a trademark assassination move by the FSB. When Le Figaro asked the former secretary of the Russian Security Council, General Alexander Lebed, about whether the Russian government would conduct such false flag attacks on its citizens, he responded, "I am almost certain of it." So, while the general public sought quick answers, many politicians, journalists, and former security officers did not really believe the official line of the Russian government. And it may be hard to believe it now, but back then, Russia had some semblance of democracy and freedom of the press, so a lot of people were comfortable openly voicing their disagreement with the official version, which blamed the Chechens for the explosion. The stage was now set for the Second Chechen War. What was Putin's motive behind starting the Second War? There are both personal and national interests to consider here. Putin had become prime minister in the middle of an economic crisis in Russia and another conflict in the North Caucasus. At the time, Yeltsin was regularly changing his prime ministers, and an unremarkable Putin did not really appear to be a person who would last. But solving the crisis in Chechnya once and for all was something that could set him apart from the rest at the time, when the second presidential term of an old and unhealthy Boris Yeltsin was coming to an end. After years of despair, disillusionment, and instability in 1990s Russia, and following a series of explosions, the Russian public was looking for somebody who could get the house in order. Getting Chechnya back under Russian control was going to be the proper political debut Putin needed. But apart from Putin's motivation, we have to consider Russia's interest in this as a whole as well. Losing Chechnya for good may have caused a domino effect in the Russian Federation. After all, if Chechnya could be independent, why couldn't wealthier Russian subjects like Dagestan do the same? Russia did not want to risk that and sought to turn around the embarrassing defeat of the First War. In early September, the Russian leadership made a decision to conduct a military operation in Chechnya. On September 6th, the Russians started to bombard what they claimed to be Chechen military infrastructure. On September 18th, the border with Chechnya was blockaded by Russian troops. 5 days later, Russian President Yeltsin signed an order to conduct a counter-terrorism operation in the North Caucasus. On that day, September 23rd, the Russian army started bombing Chechnya in earnest. Power stations, communication infrastructure, oil industry infrastructure, and many other objects were subject to Russian airstrikes. Aslan Maskhadov ordered general mobilization, and despite being secular, he called on the religious authorities of Chechnya to declare Gazavat, a holy war against the invaders. However, the political scene in Chechnya was extremely fractured on the eve of the Second Chechen War, which even led to several skirmishes between Maskhadov loyalists and his opposition. By declaring a holy war, he wanted to unite the Chechens against the common enemy. He appointed Shamil Basayev the commander of the eastern sector, Ruslan Galiev commander of the western sector, and Magomed Habiev to the central sector. At least the first two were in open conflict with Maskhadov before the war. Chechnya had some 10,000 fighters, with almost half of them waiting for the Russian army in the capital Grozny. According to different estimates, the Russian army had 80,000 to 100,000 men deployed to the border with Chechnya. Colonel General Kazantsev, the commander of the joint grouping of Russian forces in the North Caucasus, was appointed the commander of the Russian army in Chechnya. The Russian army was divided into the eastern grouping, commanded by Lieutenant General Gennady Trushev, the western grouping, commanded by Major General Shemanov, the northern grouping, commanded by General Kachev, and the Grozny grouping, commanded by Lieutenant General Bulgakov. Unlike the First War, this time the Russians were more prepared. They had been organizing a unit specifically trained for mountain warfare. According to Michael Orr, the responsiveness of the Russian Air Force to requests of the ground forces was much better. In general, cohesiveness between different branches of the Russian army was on a much higher level. A notable detail is that the main political spokesman for the war from Russia was not President Yeltsin but Prime Minister Putin. During the war, he once promised to follow terrorists everywhere and wipe them out in the shitter if they catch them there. After heavily bombing Chechnya for a few days, the Russian army launched its ground assault on September 30th. Just like in the First War, the initial goal of the Russian army was to capture the relatively more straightforward terrain north of the river Terek. The northern grouping advanced towards Kalinovskaya and Shelkovskaya, while the eastern grouping advanced from Kizlyar towards Terek. In mid-October, the western grouping entered Chechnya from Ingushetia. The Russian progress was swift. By October 16th, the Russian army was in control of the area north of Terek. The Chechen groups were resisting, but apparently their main focus was on the capital Grozny, and they intended to make a stand there, similar to the First War. Maskhadov's calls to the Russian government to talk and to NATO to somehow stop the war were ignored. Chechens were on their own, against a much better prepared enemy. After reaching Terek, the Russian army started the second phase of its operations, capturing the ground around Grozny and isolating the capital from the rest of Chechnya. On October 18th, the Russian army crossed the Terek and started closing in on Grozny. The city was under heavy bombardment. On October 21st, the central market of Grozny was bombed under the pretext of selling illegal arms. Up to 140 people were killed in one of the worst cases of civilian bombing in the Second Chechen War. The humanitarian corridor enabling Grozny residents to leave the city was targeted by the Russian airstrikes too. Gdemys, one of the biggest cities of Chechnya, was given up after a few days of fighting by the religious leader of Chechnya, Mufti Ahmad Kadyrov, in early November. Kadyrov fought against the Russians in the First Chechen War, but this time decided to side with them, which was a sign of things to come. In November and December, the Russian army captured Achkoy Matan, Urus Matan, Argun, Kankala, and Shali. With the capture of Shali by mid-December, they encircled Grozny. The Chechens were inflicting losses by ambushing the Russians, but they could not stop the progress of the overwhelming Russian force. Now the price was Grozny. In the First Chechen War, the Russian army's plan for Grozny was to encircle it from three sides and leave the south open. They hoped that Chechen fighters would be overwhelmed and forced to flee to the mountains to the south. Instead, this plan allowed the Chechens to reinforce Grozny's defense. This time, Grozny was blockaded from all sides, as the Russian army closed in on the Chechen capital from 5 directions: from the northeast near the Sunja River, from the east along the airport and Kankala, from the south and southwest, and along the northwestern road. As early as December 6th, the Russian army offered Grozny residents the chance to leave through the humanitarian corridor, warning that those who remained would be considered combatants. This demonstrated the intention of the Russian command. They were going to destroy the city without any regard for civilian life. On December 15th, the Russian army made its first significant attempt to capture Grozny. The eastern grouping advanced from the military base in Kankala with several tanks and armoured personnel carriers. They were stopped in the Minutka Square, where the Chechen forces destroyed at least 7 tanks and 8 armoured personnel carriers, according to witnesses. The Russians had to withdraw. But towards the end of December, the Russian army restarted its assaults on Grozny and gained some ground, despite fierce resistance by the Chechens. On December 17th, the 20th Motor Rifle Division was deployed to the Chechen-Georgian border to prevent any supplies coming from Pankisi Gorge. By early September, the Russians captured Argun, defeating Ibn al-Khattab's group. On January 9th, the Chechen groups caught the Russians by surprise, counterattacking and regaining Argun in this sector and Shali south of Grozny. But this was arguably the last big success of the Chechen forces. In a few days, the Russians recaptured both towns and took Vedeno under their control. By early February, the Russians successfully completed the operation in the south by capturing Itimkali. This was another major blow to the Chechen resistance, which was now cut out of an important supply line. On January 17th, the Russian army started a major assault on Grozny. They quickly gained ground and a day later captured the bridge on the Sunja River in the middle of the city. Grozny was under intense shelling, and the whole city was a combat zone. Under heavy pressure from the Russians, a few thousand Chechen fighters tried to withdraw to the south beyond the Sunja River in late January, but lost a lot of men to Russian fire and minefields. On February 6th, Putin announced the capture of Grozny. Now, the Russian army was going to fight in the mountains to defeat the remaining Chechen rebels. The Russians created the central grouping to assist in this effort. By late February, the western grouping blockaded Khersenio, while the eastern grouping blockaded Uluskert, Dachibozoi and Yarishmady. In early March, Geliev's battalion was defeated in Komsomolsk. The Russians declared victory and the end of the military phase of the counter-terrorist operation in Chechnya. The Mufti of Chechnya, Ahmad Kadyrov, was appointed the head of the country by the Russians. The remaining Chechen fighters engaged in guerrilla warfare for a few years, but Putin was confident enough in the situation to remove the army from Chechnya in January 2001. The Russians managed to co-opt some of the Chechen leaders, including the aforementioned Kadyrov, Yamudayev brothers, Kikiev and others, who were now fighting the rebels in the mountains. Gradually, the rebel forces were being decimated. In 2002, Al-Khattab was killed by the FSB. In 2003, Geliev's battalion was largely destroyed and its leader killed. In 2005, Aslan Maskadov was killed in Tolstoy Yurt. In 2006, Shamil Basiev was killed. It was not completely smooth for the Russians and pro-Kremlin Chechens. Basiev organized several terrorist attacks in Russia before being killed. Kadyrov was killed in an explosion in 2004, and he was replaced by his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, who has since become one of Putin's closest allies. In 2009, the counter-terrorist regime in Chechnya was abolished by the Russian government. Chechnya is still under the iron grip of Ramzan Kadyrov, who rules the country with zero tolerance for any opposition and minimal interference from the Kremlin. Unlike the First War, during the Second War, the Russian government managed to co-opt important groups of the Chechen elite and gave them full power in Chechnya in exchange for nominal recognition of Russian sovereignty over the country. Chechnya still receives 300 billion rubles annually, according to the latest numbers provided by Kadyrov, which amounts to $4.5 billion. At the same time, Kadyrov's entourage plays an oversized role as Putin's foot soldiers, and they are often blamed for the political assassination of Putin's opponents, including Boris Nemtsov. This oversized influence, and the fact that Kadyrov and his entourage started to worship and propagate a more fundamentalist version of Islam, is a constant annoyance for the Russian nationalists and might spark future unrest. The Second Chechen War resulted in a Russian victory. The dream of independence of the Chechens was shattered due to the exhaustion of Chechen society, fragmentation of its political elite, and minimal international support. The Russians were much better prepared for the Second War, and managed to divide the pro-independence camp in Chechnya, co-opting key individuals and groups. 6,000 to 14,000 Russian soldiers were killed in this war, while at least 3,000 Chechen fighters were killed. According to Amnesty International, some 25,000 civilians were killed by 2007 in Chechnya. The Second Chechen War also had a profound impact on Russia. Putin's victory in Chechnya skyrocketed his popularity in Russia. He comfortably won the 2000 presidential election and never looked back. Legitimacy won in this war enabled him to completely transform the Russian political system, dismantling any trace of democracy and press freedom in Russia. To prevent any future attempts of federal subjects to demand independence, in 2004, Putin abolished governor elections and started appointing Republican and regional leaders personally from then on. Victory in the Second Chechen War was one of the key factors behind the current personalist regime of Vladimir Putin. We will continue talking about other modern conflicts in the near future, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.